quick disclaimer before we get started. I just want to let you know that I am not an expert in many of the things I'm going to show in this video. This is just stuff that I figured out and played with over the years, and it kind of works for me. So I'm just going to give you a brief explanation of all this stuff, and yeah, hopefully it helps you for future videos that I might put out. With that being said, let's move forward. So first off, I want to talk about Maya history. So, Maya history, what is it? History is every single thing that you do to this mesh is recorded in your inputs. So let's look at the first input here, polysphere. Polysphere is your actual geometry itself. If I click it, you can see I have options for the radius of it. I have the subdivisions around the axis and the height. So that's your first piece of history that you have access to manipulate whenever you want. Although, depending on what stuff you add after, this won't really update very well with the other tools that stack up. You'll see in a moment. Now, if I wanted to, I can go into face mode, and let's say I select a bunch of faces, shift right click, extrude, bring this out, and let's also give it a little bevel. So let's go, I'm going to go shift right click, edges, edge perimeter, now shift bevel edge, and let's reduce that a little bit. Segments. Cool. So we have that. Let's go into object mode. And now you can see our most recent thing that we did is expanded, which is our bevel, but we have our polysphere still here with our divisions, our extrude, and then our bevel. See, it's all stacking up. Old at the bottom, newest stuff at the top. So if I went to extrude, you'll see here that I can actually take like local translate and stuff, and I can move this around even though I started doing other things on top of it. Random, what? Oh, I thought that did something cool. Whatever. Local scale. Yeah, things act a little bit funny, and some of this stuff can be pretty buggy and break your Maya, unfortunately. So a lot of people tend to have a lot of complaints about Maya history. It's not super well maintained, honestly. But it's not very often that I ever go and manipulate anything that's in the past. It's just not a practice I'm into. I always do it live as I go and try to fix things and repair them and keep clearing the history. And you want to clear this history every so often, because the more stuff that you do, so let's just, for the hell of it, go multi-cut, add a whole bunch of stuff, and then let's maybe hit it all with a smooth. And then let's grab a bunch of this stuff and hit it with some really, really dirty add divisions of faces. And now we'll hit those with an extrude. And then we'll go edges, perimeter, and we'll hit these with a bevel. And bevel won't work because I have a lot of weird corners here, so my bad, but there's still a bevel tucked away even though I didn't change it. So very dirty. If I select some of these points, you might see, oh, never mind. But yeah, we did a lot of stuff to this mesh, and it's all stacked up, and it can get very messy. Let's see if I can crash my Maya. You know what? Not a good idea, because I don't want to stop my recording. Yeah, so all of that stuff stacks up, and it will slow down your Maya and make your file size a little bit bigger at times, I believe, according to some people. So how do we get rid of this and just make it so our model is just as it is with no inputs connected? I can hit Shift-Alt-D, which is delete history, or you can come up to edit, delete by type, history, and you can see it's hotkey. So I'm going to delete Shift-Alt-D. Now it's all gone. And now you're just dealing with the geometry. It's lighter now. It should be faster to work with, depending on what you're doing. Yeah, so Maya history is very, very important, and yeah, you're going to see how it stacks up with some clusters and other stuff as I go on, because I like my history compared to what other software does, just in the case of match move for how I do things. That being said, I've kind of made it my methods over the past couple years, and I have a lot more to learn, but you know, this is just how I do things. So yeah, let's move on to the other stuff. Let's take a look at joints. I'm going to use the cylinder over here. I'm going to hit Control A, bring up my inputs here. Let's give it some divisions on the height and make it a little taller. So I'm going to go over to the front view, and to place a joint, what you want to do is hold space, come over to skeleton, and create joints. And now I can hold X so I can snap to grid when I click. And yeah, you can't see them right now. I could have been in wireframe. I can hit 4 and now we can see our joints. If you want to be in shaded view, come up to shading and X-ray joints. So now you can see the joints. Well, not in my perspective view. You also have to change it. Now you can see our joints in front of our geometry at all times. So the joints here, you could see our bones. If I grab any of them up the hierarchy, we can now manipulate these. And what's awesome is that when you move these and move it around, obviously the joints keep with their original orientation, unlike a cluster, which we'll get to. So I'm going to undo that. Now to bind the skin, you can select your skeleton and your geometry together, hold space, come over to skin, bind skin. There's many options to go along with this, but I'm not going to mess with any of this because I'm not great. I'm going to go bind skin, and now when we mess with this, you could see we have a noodle. So that's joints. Typically when I use joints for an object, it's because the object is rotating in all different directions. Otherwise I play it simple and I use clusters. Or I can use both, because I can add clusters to these vertices and continue to mess with them, but again, I'll come back to clusters. But you can do a lot of nifty things. You can change the length of this stuff if you really needed to, because some shots you just don't have enough camera data and you kind of have to get a little dirty, but try to avoid scaling joints if you can. Like I said, you can rotate this all around, and what's nice is that the joints will keep their axis, unlike a cluster, because things get messy when you start to get at extreme angles, and now suddenly your cluster might move everything at an awkward angle. When you want it to go up, your cluster will go this way. So yeah, joints are clean, joints are flexible. If you wanted to paint the weights on these joints because something's acting a little bit funny, so if I give this a bend, now if I select this, hold right click, come up to paint skin weights tool. Now you can see the weights and you have your tool settings, so you can select whichever joint that you want to mess with. And let's say I want to smooth something out, so I'll come over here. We have our brush. I can hold B, and now I can soften things out a bit if I feel I need to. Nice. And let's say that I had a position that I always wanted to return to for some reason. So this position, I could select our skeleton, right click, set preferred angle. So now any kind of adjustment that I make to this mesh, I can always select the mesh, right click, assume preferred angle. Oh, it looks like the scale didn't return. Okay, that's new to me. Alright, well, anything but scale, but I guess scale isn't a typical thing you want to do to joints, really. The annoying things with joints for me, because I don't work with joints too often for fine details on surfaces, is just what it takes to add something. Like if I were to go with skeleton, create joints, hold V so I can snap to a vertex on the surface, there we go. I have an end bone, or one of these little circle things. I don't know what they're called. But let's say I have this on the edge of my surface, so I can take to the nearest bone, hit P to parent, and yeah, you got that. If you don't want to see this, you can come over to Control A, Draw Style, Bone, None. Oh, it took away that one too. I actually didn't know that. How did I do that before? Maybe I did a secondary joint before. I don't know. Anyway, whatever. So this joint, now I can select that, select the mesh, hold space, come down to skin, edit influences, add influence, and we can go into options and see that we have a couple bit of stuff. I'm going to make it 0. So this joint shouldn't have any influence. Good. So now if I want to mess with that, like you could see I can mess with this stuff here. The joint stays where it should. I could go, let's name it something like surface. I don't know, whatever. Now I can right click my mesh, paint skin weights, and we can go and select our surface here. We'll go we'll go replace, hold B, and does that lock matter? You could see it's stealing away a bunch of influence from the other stuff, so it's not the best. But I'm holding shift so I can smooth out this area. But yeah, you got to be mindful. Always try to find the... If you're going to put a surface detail, make sure you grab the parent to the joint that's influencing that area the most. There are better ways to do this. Like, there's ways to do this where it's normalized or whatever, but I don't have access to those scripts anymore, and I just don't do this method now. But yeah, now that I've done that little bit of paint, you can see we can manipulate that point separately. And I can move this. You can see we've painted full influence onto that little joint, so that bit of geometry is staying where it should. Let's take this and give it a smooth. Yeah. And if you wanted, if you have a point track that's projected onto a mesh, or you've just manually scaled your point tracker into depth from like Synthesize or something, you can parent this point to it, and now you have a tracker stuck to this point. So that's a very dirty way to do this. I'm not good at rigging. I'm not good at like stuff like this. I have dirty ways to do things that I've learned over the years because I didn't have access to anything more. But yeah, that would be joints for me and how I use them. So let's look at clusters on a plane now, because in the upcoming tutorial we're going to be deforming a card, a little bending card. So over here, clusters. Why do I use clusters? Clusters are easy if your object is not doing anything crazy like this, which I might do that anyway just to show the problem in the shot and show how I work around it. But yes, clusters are fast and easy to paint and whatever, and you can keep layering them up 100 times and they're not very heavy. So a cluster, here's what a cluster is. For a cluster, you want to select whatever vertices you want, spacebar, deform, cluster. And it gives you this little tiny object thing, and you can grab it, and now you can animate and keyframe this little thing, and you can move your geometry around. I like this because, again, that was extremely fast. If I wanted to, if I hold Alt and arrow keys, you could see I can nudge this stuff around like a tracker. You could do this with joints too, actually, but joints are a little bit more annoying to get that end cap going. So let me zero that. Actually, let me go zero. Actually, you know what? I'm just going to delete this cluster, which, yeah, gets rid of all the stuff that we did. So you saw that the geometry was a little bit jagged and ugly. So how do we fix that? Let's go ahead and select a bunch of points. If I wanted to manipulate just this area, I actually don't just select that area only. I select the whole mesh. And now I can go spacebar, recent commands, create cluster. And yeah, so now that cluster is moving the whole geometry because yeah, we painted it all with a value of 1. So to paint a cluster, you can't just right click, and you don't have a paint skin weights tool because there's no binded skin. It's, yeah. To paint a cluster, you right click, come down to paint, cluster, and then you're going to have a list of all your, you're going to have a list of all your clusters right here. Now that I've clicked that, you can see that our influence is solid 1 everywhere. If I hold B to shrink down this brush, let's go ahead and flood it with nothing. So I'm going to go replace with a value of 0. So, you know, I can paint 0 now, but I'm going to hit flood, so it just floods 0 everywhere. There we go. And now I'll turn this back to 1. So if I want to paint this area over here, I'll give it a nice paint. I'm on the softest brush. Usually I actually paint with the solid one because I like to get the exact amount of, I don't know, I like to keep my paint clean. And then I go to a smooth and I hit it, and you know, it disperses across one division every time you hit flood. And I could see it creeping up the edge there. So now I can select that cluster and look at that nice soft plane that we have. So again, I'm gonna delete this. So the thing with a postcard, I do want to mention the reason why, again, another reason why I like clusters is because with geometry, with joints, if I were to start like live modeling this geometry, this stuff is going to work. It's going to follow along. But it starts to get a little scary and messy with the history if I start to add more joints that's influencing this new geometry. I tend to had some crashes happened a lot to me when I used to do that. So the geometry here, so with clusters, it just seems lighter to stack the history. So here's how I would do a postcard. I'm gonna go to the input, take the subdivisions all the way down, and I start with the absolute lowest subdivision I possibly can. So hey, 4 corners of the paper, cool. Do whatever you got to do if you want to scale it to be as best fit as you can. If you want, you could zero it out, but typically I clean everything up at the very end, because when I bake my mesh, I duplicate it, do some UVs, do some freeze transformations, orientation, anything I have to. But you could do it here if you want. It's up to you. Your shot, your rules. But yes, so now we've made our postcard, and here's what I would do. I would go vertices, select our 1 point, create cluster, and I would start animating these points. If this was attached to an object solve and rotating and doing its stuff, here's what a cluster does, unfortunately. So now that we've rotated the object, if I move this up, you could see it doesn't follow the same orientation. There's ways to work around this, but it's typically been done using scripts for me. There's some wizards out there who know how to construct the hierarchy and system to make this work, but that's a benefit of taking the time to add joints as you go, because the joints, they will, no matter the orientation, they will always follow the correct direction. But most shots, I find, don't give me this problem, honestly. Usually if it's a shot of a postcard, the postcard doesn't flip around a lot because people want to focus on the image on the card. I've just found that to be the case a lot of the times. That might not be the case for most people, but I have a workaround for that, which we can take a look at when I actually do a shot like this in a day or two or a few days, whenever I do the tutorial. Honestly, I don't know. I shouldn't have held myself to that. Alright, so yes, so now I add my cluster here, holding G to repeat, and there we go. I've got a cluster for all 4 sides. So I'm gonna add a couple keyframes just to make this part easier to see. So we have all the deformations for our card now, let's say. I kind of want to do the other side. Well, that's too bad. I'm not gonna. Okay, so now let's say we've match moved all 4 corners of our paper, and the corners are sticking well. We've gotten the depth as realistically done as we can. Wow, I butchered that. We've done the points as well as we could. So now the paper bends in the middle, right? Because it's paper, it bends. But we have these perfect straight lines. So again, nice thing with my history is I can go multi-cut, start adding in some division. Typically I wouldn't start like this. I only start with 1 loop, and then I'll do these 2 points, and then I'll add in another loop, and then I'll work on those 3 points. Because if you add in too many loops too fast and then start to mess with these points, you're not going to interpolate these points. So we're gonna start with these. So I could go with this point, add in a cluster, and now I can animate this, and you can see the middle, right? The middle where we had a vertex is moving. So when we add an extra edge going this way, that new point is going to be inheriting that motion. So now we've kind of done the bend. If you wanted for some reason with a cluster, you can select multiple points like this and do them together at first. But I don't know. I don't usually like to jump ahead like that, because you might introduce motion into another point that you don't want to. So now that we have this, this is where I might feel comfortable adding in another division. So I'll go Shift, multi-cut, and yeah, and so on. Maybe it was possible for you to do a cluster for all 3 of these. Maybe not. Maybe you got to do them individually. But I'm gonna hurry up here. And yeah, deforming the middle. Cool stuff. Nice. So the downside to a card, which on the shot I'll show how I fix, is, oh, by the way, I'm going to be showing more of this smooth thing on the cube, but watch when I smooth the card. See if I hit 3 on my keyboard to get that exponential smooth. We've match moved all these points to exactly how we want them, but if I hit smooth, hey, the geometry moved and now you don't have that detail. So when you're wanting to smooth your geometry, you could come down to smooth exponential, which is, that's what we just did with 3. So we've lost, it's eroded away our edges that we match moved. You could come to, wow, I lost my smooth. Where is it? Mesh, smooth. We could go come over to linear, and linear it'll be easier to show on the other object, but you can use a push strength of 1, smooth, and now you've kept your original positions, but it's pushed the geo in some areas here on the edges. It kind of did a weird warp, which I don't know a way around. But another way that I kind of recently figured out, because I didn't really think of it out honestly, but to round out the edges, you can go multi-cut or edge loop and go into options, and here you're going to see you have edge flow. So now if I click and middle mouse this anywhere, the geometry is going to start rounding itself out, and it doesn't affect anything in a negative way. So you can see it rounded itself out, and what's kind of cool about this is it's live. So when I bend this all, my original points are sticking where they should, but all those in-between vertices are being calculated to be rounded out. But again, those original points that we deformed are intact. So that's a very nice way to add some smoothness to your object, and if your paper kind of accurately follows what your real paper is doing, your real paper is going to have a smooth bend, and this should fill it in. Just keep in mind, the more that you add more geometry and clusters and stuff, you can see our history starting to stack up. Now, an object like this is so light, this will take a long time to actually slow down if you just add whatever divisions you need to add, rather than jumping straight ahead and going smooth, smooth, smooth. And see, even now, like now you can see it's starting to slow down. It's very workable. It's quite workable, but it's starting to get a little bit framey. So that's all I have to say about the plane, but let's move over to the sphere. Okay, so now I'm just going to show clusters on this cube. It might be a little bit repeating what I did over here. I kind of skipped ahead a little bit more than I should have, but let's just do it one more time on the cube right here. So I'm going to go ahead and go to vertex mode, add some clusters, create cluster, and let's just add in a couple big gradual keyframes just to look at. There we've got that. Let's maybe grab, maybe we never see this back corner, so I'm going to link it to this one just to have a little bit of motion at the back of this geometry, even though we don't see it. So add a cluster there. Okay, so we have some motion now. So this is where I was going to show off the smooth thing, because, so here's what's up. Usually when you're doing a match move, you're doing a lot of organic, flexible things, and that's why you have to deform. So eventually you gotta subdivide and you gotta round things out and make it look, more organic. So the problem with smoothing is somebody might add a bunch of divisions and instinctually hit 3 on their keyboard, which gives you this exponential smooth. By the way, I don't know what exponential or linear means, so I'm just gonna say I'm just gonna say what it is based on the smooth options, but this is an exponential smooth. We can move this around, but that corner where it actually is, if I hit 2, that's what's sticking. And now we've eroded this away, and this doesn't match at all. So how do we avoid that? I'm going to go back to 1. So the better way to smooth this is, what if it did the rounding, except it rounded outwards? So you could do this a couple ways. You could go to that multi-cut like I showed, and with edge flow, oh well, it's not going to do a good job here because the shape's a little bit funny. Never mind. Don't do that. So I could go shift, smooth, options, and we're gonna put this. Let's hide this. Here's exponential. This is what happens when you hit 3 on your keyboard. So if I smooth it, hey, it erodes inwards, and we got our divisions. Great. Not good. So shift, right click, smooth. I'm going to switch over to linear. So with linear, you have your options at the bottom now, and there's not as many. This is old, I believe. Is it? I think linear is old. Maybe it's not. I don't know. So here you have push strength. If I hit defaults, reset settings, and then go to linear, just so, yeah, I didn't mess with anything except for push strength. So if I hit smooth now, we get the same thing. The same effect as exponential. Except you can come over to, or honestly, if you were in that option box, you could turn push strength all the way up. Or I can come here to the side and I can scale it up. And now the geometry is smoothing outwards instead of eroding inwards. And you can see that the cluster lines up with our point here. The original tracker is intact. So now, if you needed to, you have these organic rounded out edges. Again, keep low res as possible when you're doing this. So I can come over here and start adding some more clusters. And again, you could see that when things warp, your cluster doesn't follow. But that's kind of fine. I don't actually look at the cluster. I look at the locator itself when I match move. And again, usually I hold Alt on my keyboard and I use arrow keys to nudge my vertex around. Because typically a lot of shots, again, they don't do this. And if it's a head that's doing some full proper turning, I'm usually doing a rig, like I'm usually making some joints so I can create a jaw, and once I get all the big features out of the way, then I'll do some minor fixes with some clusters. But at work, you know, we also have a script that creates a cluster, but the cluster will actually follow the mesh. Yes, so that's about that, honestly. I didn't really have too much to show on the cube, I guess. Let me see if I could think of something else before I end this off. I guess I could make this be known. Somebody might have wondered about lattice deformers, why I might use any of the other deformers that Maya has to offer. Because if you go to Deform, there is so much stuff here. There's like a lot of stuff. The only ones that I kind of use is wrap and sometimes lattice, but lattice is more for just trying to model stuff, really. There are some cool deformation tricks to do with it, but not for match move. It's not easy to control for match move at all. So blend shapes, some people might use blend shapes, and you know, blend shapes is you can duplicate your object a number of times, do whatever sculpting and modeling that you want to do to them, and then you can apply all of those as controllers to your original object. But I don't know, I just don't find that one super useful when I can mess with the geometry and sculpt my stuff per frame as I go, because you cannot sculpt the amount of frames required to make an accurate smooth animation using blend shapes. That's just, it's not reasonable. You're getting into like the territory of those stop motion movies from Leica where they have to 3D print every single frame of expression on those faces. Yeah, it's absurd. But yeah, cluster is not very handy. Sometimes I use wrap. Why would I use wrap? Because sometimes your geometry gets so screwed up that you need to clean it up. So if I duplicate a piece of geometry, so I have a duplicate, I'm going to hit Shift-I to isolate. And now maybe I want to modify this in a very specific way. I don't know what the specific way might be right now, but you know, I just did it. So let's delete that history, and I'll click off, hit Shift-I to bring it back. And that new sphere, I can go to the old cube and deform, wrap. So now this new the new weird deformed cube will follow the old one. So if I hit 4, just so we can see both of them. Yeah, it's following. That's all there is. Sometimes I use that a lot. I typically use that for cleanup at the very end of my scenes. So on that note, that is all I have to show on kind of the little bits of methods and stuff that I use. I could have worded that better. Oh well, I'll get better at it sometime. So yeah, that's all I had. And hopefully you enjoy the tutorial about the card that I'm hopefully going to make here very soon.